Hi guys, this is day 25 of the AS Economics 42-day revision challenge, and today we are doing comparative and absolute advantage. So let's start with the absolute advantage first. We say a country has an absolute advantage if it can produce a good using fewer resources as compared to another country. In other words, it can produce more output of a good using the same amount of resources. So for us, absolute advantage simply means who can make more using the same resources. Clearly, if you can make more using the same resources, or in other words, you can make the same output using fewer resources, the cost of making those units will be much lower. So absolute advantage simply means producing something at a lower cost than another country, or producing something with the same resources much more as compared to another country. On the other hand, a country is said to have a comparative advantage when we say it has a lower opportunity cost in the production of a good as compared to another country. What do we mean by opportunity cost? Well, which means how much do you give up? So the idea goes this, that there could be a possibility that a country could have an absolute advantage in the production of a good, but when it comes to another country, it might not have a comparative advantage, which is basically producing at a lower opportunity cost. What we also say therefore is this, that having an absolute advantage doesn't mean an economy should produce that good. What we care about is comparative advantage. Basically, if we do have comparative advantage, that's when we specialize and that's when we trade. So let's look at an example. So I have an example here where, let's say we have two countries. We have UK and US, and right now they are producing two goods, which is vacuum cleaner and digital camera. So there are only two goods out there, and there are only two countries out there. In this two countries, two good analysis, let's say UK and US are right now not specializing, and let's say both countries are dividing their resources equally in the production of both goods. So half of land, labor, capital and enterprise is going into vacuum cleaner, and similarly half of the resources are going into digital camera for both countries, UK and US. Now, if they are dividing their resources equally, we have this kind of a table. So let's say UK right now is making 20 of vacuum cleaners and 10 of digital cameras, and vice versa. US is making 10 of sort of vacuum cleaner and 20 of digital camera. So if I look at total production right now, the total production is 30 and 30 of both the goods. Let's see this in terms of diagram now. So let's say I have UK and US here, and let's say this is vacuum cleaner on my x-axis, digital camera on my y-axis. And so let's see this in terms of diagram. So right now UK is making 20 of vacuum cleaner and 10 of digital camera. So I have a linear PPC that I'm going to draw, and right in the middle I'm going to write 20 of vacuum cleaner and 10 of digital camera. And the reason why I'm writing this right in the middle is because I know half of my resources are going into land labor, or half of my land labor capital enterprise, all the resources are going into making vacuum cleaner, and I'm making 20. If I completely dedicate my resources towards vacuum cleaner, I'm going to make 40. Vice versa, in the case of digital camera, half the resources give me 10. If I completely dedicate all my resources, I'll get 20, and that's why I wrote this value here right in the middle. So right now UK is at point A. On the other hand, US also has a linear kind of a PPC, but this PPC is something like this, where I'm going to write right in the middle this combination B, which is right now UK is making 20 of digital camera and 10 of vacuum cleaners. Now if they can dedicate the resources completely to vacuum cleaner, they'll get 20, versus digital camera, they'll get 40. So simply, if I ask you who has an absolute advantage, you'll tell me that who is making more, and the answer is this, that UK is making right now, or UK has a potential to make more vacuum cleaners as compared to US that can only make 20 vacuum cleaners. So 40 vacuum cleaners for UK versus 20. And similarly, when it comes to digital camera, I can say US has an absolute advantage because they can make 40 versus UK, which can only make 20. How do I show that in terms of a single diagram? So if I just make a single diagram, that will be much more obvious. So let's say vacuum cleaner is here, digital camera is here. I have what we call this kind of a diagram where one value is 40 and 20. This is US versus UK is 20 and 40. So when you can look at this diagram, you can see this clearly that absolute advantage means who can make more, and therefore US is good at making vacuum digital cameras and UK is good at making vacuum cleaners. So if we just focus on absolute advantage and don't look at comparative advantage, which is opportunity cost, one could say this, that UK should focus on more on vacuum cleaner and US should focus on digital camera. Now this is what we call a case of reciprocal absolute advantage, where each country has an absolute advantage in the production of one product. So these guys, UK has it in vacuum cleaner and US has it in digital camera, and this is what we call an obvious case of specialization. Why is that so? Because when each country specialize, you can see this, that if UK just go and focus on production of vacuum cleaner, they will come to this point, let's call it A dash, while US can come to this point, which is B dash. So if I go back to my table, when they specialize, UK will make 40 of vacuum cleaner and nothing of digital camera, while US can make nothing of vacuum cleaner and 40 of digital cameras, and that means total output will now be 40 and 40. But before specialization, when we looked at vacuum cleaner and digital cameras, I'm just going to sort of show you the values here. UK was making 20 and 10 and US was making 10 and 20, which means the overall output was 30. Now we haven't done the trade, but you can look at this. Before specialization, the world output was 30 and 30 of each, but simply by specialization we've gotten the world output to be much more. So what we can say is this, that when you have a case of what we call reciprocal absolute advantage, both countries can benefit in the case of reciprocal absolute advantage, where they can specialize and trade at an exchange rate that is mutually beneficial. Now, how do we get that exchange rate? I'm going to talk about this in a little while, but the idea is simply that before specialization, the world was making 30 and 30, but after specialization, the world is making 40 and 40, which is good for the whole world when UK and US specialize and not produce both goods. Now, one thing we need to understand is also the idea that when you have a reciprocal absolute advantage, it also means comparative advantage, and I want to show that in terms of our working. But what we are saying is that reciprocal absolute advantage also means comparative advantage is taking place, and that's why it becomes an important basis for trade. So let's see this in terms of a diagram. So when you look at diagram for the one that we draw earlier, we had a case like this one. So this is our US and this is UK. Now, in order to know the comparative advantage, what we need to do is find opportunity cost. So look at this, guys. Whenever US is making 40 of digital cameras, they are also losing out on making 20 vacuum cleaners. So 40 digital cameras, 40 DC is equal to 20 vacuum cleaners for US. In other words, I can say this: one vacuum cleaner is equal to 2 digital camera. Why? If I take 40 on the, if I go take 20 on the other side, 40 divided by 20 is 2. So 2 digital cameras are equal to 1 vacuum cleaner. I can rewrite this same thing. I can say, or if I take this 2 on the other side, 1 digital camera is equal to 1 DC is equal to half vacuum cleaner. So I can get myself the opportunity cost of making 1 digital camera, which is equal to half VC, or in other words, 1 vacuum cleaner is equal to 2 DC. In the case of UK, let's write this. In the case of UK, you can see this, that it's 20 of DC is equal to 40 of VC. So 20 DC is equal to 20 DC is equal to 40 VC, or 1 DC is equal to 40 divided by 20 is 2 VC. On the other hand, I can rewrite this, or 1 VC, because if I bring this 2 on the other side, 1 VC is equal to half DC. So when I look at these opportunity costs, 1 VC is equal to half DC. Now look at this, guys. When I look at these opportunity costs, when UK make 1 vacuum cleaner, they only lose half digital camera. But when US is making 1 vacuum cleaner, they're losing 2 digital cameras. So clearly UK is losing less in terms of vacuum cleaner. Vice versa, when US is making 1 digital camera, they're only losing half vacuum cleaner. But when when UK is making 1 digital camera, they're losing 2 vacuum cleaner. They're losing much more. So when you look at comparative advantage in this case would be, for UK it is in vacuum cleaners because they're losing less, while for US it is in digital camera. And so what I said earlier is this, that when you have a reciprocal absolute advantage, you also have a case of comparative advantage. So UK has a comparative advantage in vacuum cleaner, but it also has a absolute advantage in vacuum cleaner, and US has a comparative advantage in digital camera, which is also an absolute advantage. So comparative advantage and absolute advantage will be in the same goods when there is a reciprocal absolute advantage, where one country is good at one thing and another country is good at another thing. Now the question that we need to ask is that, okay, now we know that these both countries should specialize, and this UK is making, for example, only vacuum cleaners. So let's say A dash is where they are. US is probably going to make only digital cameras, so they are at B dash. So they need to now trade. So what exchange rate is the one that we should have chosen is the next question we need to ask. And the answer is, the exchange rate that we choose is the one that lies, let me write this, exchange rate must lie between the two countries opportunity cost. So for example, if you look at UK, the opportunity cost is 1 vacuum cleaner is equal to half DC. For US, the opportunity cost is 1 vacuum cleaner is equal to 2 DC. So one exchange rate that can be lying in between these two opportunity costs could be 1 vacuum cleaner is equal to 1 digital camera. So this could be what we call an acceptable exchange rate, and I could sort of look at how this is an acceptable exchange rate, because when you have 1 vacuum cleaner is equal to 1 digital camera, this means for 40 vacuum cleaners you can basically get 40 digital cameras. So if I sort of put this exchange rate on my graph, I get myself this kind of a line. This yellow line is what we call our trading line, and this is telling us both countries are going to benefit. Why? Let's see this. Let's say UK is making 40 vacuum cleaners, and let's say they now accept this exchange rate, which is 1 VC is equal to 1 DC, which means that if they go from 40 to 20, they say, how about we give 20 of vacuum cleaners to US, and if they do so, US will give them 20 of digital cameras in return, because the exchange rate is 1 vacuum cleaner is equal to 1 DC. So 20, by giving 20 vacuum cleaners, you get 20 digital cameras as well. So when they do that, what we'll find out is this, that UK will be at point X, which is you give 20 of vacuum cleaners, but you get 20 of sort of digital camera from the other country, and you end up at point X. Similarly for US, when they make 40 digital cameras, they're giving up 20 of their digital cameras, but they get 20 of vacuum cleaners. So both countries end up being at 2020. Now look at this 2020 kind of a scenario. Now I'm going to go back to this table. So previously, before specialization, we were at this condition where UK was getting 20 and 10, and 10 and 20 was the case for US. So after specialization, what is happening is that when you look at vacuum cleaner and digital cameras, UK is getting, for 20 vacuum cleaners, they're getting 20 digital cameras, and US similarly for 20 vacuum cleaners, they're getting 20 digital cameras. So both countries are now getting more as compared to before, because when they were not trading and specializing, they used to only manage 10, but now with trade and specialization, because they made much more, they could give 20 away to another country and get 20 in return. So both countries are now at this point X. Now if you remember our PPC theory, any point to the right of the PPC is kind of like an unattainable point right now. So if you are on the orange line and suddenly I tell you you will be at this point X, you will be like, oh, I can get more of both goods, this means I'm better off. Similarly, if you're a blue line and if you can get more of both goods, you will be at X. So this X was previously unattainable, but now with trade, we are able to be at the yellow line or point X, which was previously unattainable. So the bottom line being now that when you have a reciprocal absolute advantage, you also have a comparative advantage. In a reciprocal absolute advantage, countries benefit by specializing and trading, and they trade at an exchange rate which lies between the two opportunity costs. For us in this case was 1:1. Now even when one country has an absolute advantage, David Ricardo, the economist who came up with the theory of comparative advantage, he said that even when one country has an absolute advantage in both goods, trade can still take place. We say that comparative advantage therefore forms the basis for international trade. So he gave an example. He said, what if this is the case? What if I tell you UK, this is UK, and what if this is US? So if you can see this diagram, UK has an absolute advantage in both goods. You can make more of digital cameras and more of vacuum cleaners, and similarly US can doesn't have an absolute advantage. And so in this case, what happens is that should UK trade with US, and the answer is yes. These PPCs are non-parallel, which means the opportunity cost is different, which is why this becomes what we call the basis for trade. So let's find the opportunity cost. So in the case of UK, we can say this. In the case of UK, it's 80 of DC is equal to 60 of VC, or in other words, one vacuum cleaner is equal to 4 by 3 of digital cameras. Similarly for US, it's 40 DC is equal to 40 VC, which means it's 1 VC is equal to 1 DC. So the numbers can suggest very clearly that when US make one vacuum cleaner, they only lose one digital camera. But when UK makes one vacuum cleaner, they lose more. They lose 4 by 3 of digital cameras. Clearly, UK does have an absolute advantage, but not a comparative advantage, because they lose more in terms of digital camera. But when you look at 1 DC, it's 1 DC is equal to 3 by 4 of vacuum cleaners, and here the 1 DC is equal to 1 VC. So when it comes to production of digital cameras, you can say this, that UK is really good at making digital cameras because they're only losing 3/4 of vacuum cleaner. So when you have what we call, this is the case of not a reciprocal absolute advantage. Even in the case of a case where one country is good at producing both goods, when it comes to the cost of it, when it comes to the opportunity cost of it, it doesn't make sense to specialize, to not specialize. So clearly UK, while it can make more of both goods, they will still only end up making what we call digital camera because they have a lower opportunity cost. And if that is the case, then we will say the trade will take place at an exchange rate which is mutually beneficial for both countries. So one sort of exchange rate can be which is lying between 1 DC is equal to 3 by 4 VC and 1 DC is equal to 1 VC would be 1 DC is equal to 0.8 of vacuum cleaner, but that's another story, another discussion. The idea is that even when countries do have what we call absolute advantage in both goods, they will still trade on the basis of comparative advantage, as we can see from this example. Now, what are the sources of comparative advantage? Well, there are many sources of comparative advantage. Number one is that there could be differences in factor endowment. Like a country might have what we call different resources, and that's why their cost is much lower, and that can result in what we call a lower opportunity cost. So for example, China might have cheap labor, that might result in them to become more labor intensive. Like Pakistan might have cheaper textile, and that might make them focus on textile much more, and so on. So the factor endowment is what resources are you gifted with, or what conditions you have for production of different goods. Similarly, difference in technology is what we call an acquired comparative advantage. Like Japan, for example, has an acquired comparative advantage in high technological stuff. Similarly, Germany has better technology, and that difference in technology has given them what we call a comparative advantage. Another one could be exchange rate. We know this, that if the exchange rate is high for the country, we know this, exports become expensive and imports become cheaper, and that can result in basically export prices to be higher or sometimes a loss of comparative advantage. Similarly, inflation is a rise in price level which can make our exports to be expensive and imports to be cheaper, and can result in a country to sometimes lose comparative advantage. Then comes our non-price factors. Non-price factors are like quality, design of the product, and so on. Like Germany, for example, might have a highest exchange rate, might have very high prices, but the fact that they have high quality gives them what we call a comparative advantage in the market. Our last part of the discussion is to do with the assumptions and limitations of comparative advantage. Well, one of the problems of comparative advantage is this, that we look at constant opportunity cost. When constant opportunity cost means our PPC are linear, and this means basically resources are completely mobile in the two uses. When we saw in the PPC chapter, in reality PPC should not be linear, it should be what we call concave to the origin. And the reason why it should be concave to the origin is because opportunity cost is not constant. In fact, opportunity cost increases, and the reason why it happens is because factors are not perfectly mobile in different uses. Second important assumption that we have, which has a problem, is the no transportation cost, when in reality we know that goods need to be transported from one country to another, and the transportation cost can be very high. In fact, it can be sometimes so high that the trade comparative advantage might completely eliminate. Last one is basically we assume there are no trade barriers, when in reality we know this, that trade barriers exist in real world, and those trade barriers result in countries to sometimes not end up trading despite comparative advantage. In fact, let's say if I have a comparative advantage in one good and another country put a tariff on me, then my price will no longer be the same, which means I no longer have that comparative advantage that I might have because somebody has taken it away by putting a tariff on me. So these are the things that are ignored in a comparative advantage and become what we call our limitations also in the comparative advantage theory. Having said that, comparative advantage is probably the most compelling argument why countries specialize and then therefore trade.